I am not sure if it is a law of nature, but I have noticed that parents tend to develop complementary, if not opposite, parenting styles. If dad is the strict one, then mom is the pushover. If mom is all about actions and consequences, then dad is the one that lets things slide. I haven't found any patterns based on gender though. Sometimes the mother is the tough one, and sometimes it is the father. I cannot prove this, but I suspect that it all starts when one of the parents making a resolution to be firm, which leads the second one to go soft as a complementary reaction. First comes the yin, and then comes the yang. And the thing is that for good parenting, we need both, since our children need to learn two essential facts. Number one, that every bad choice carries in it the weight of its natural consequences, since we are part of a natural world that follows the laws of nature. And number two, that every bad choice also brings with it an opportunity to show mercy, since we are also part of a supernatural world that follows the laws of grace. Maybe that is why parenthood works best when both parents are involved. In today's gospel, we hear Jesus telling us that the whole of God's law can be distilled in two commandments: to love God with all our strength and to love our neighbor as ourselves. Many volumes can be written and have been written about this passage. Jesus goes to the heart of his message, and his message is himself. Jesus tells us that it is all about love. Love is not a something, but a someone. And not just anyone. Love is God himself. By commanding us to love, God is commanding us to know him. Love of God and love of neighbor are but two different angles from which to look at the same one God. So much can be said about each of those commandments, but for the rest of this meditation, I would like to focus on the second. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. I think that sometimes we don't really pay attention to this commandment. Listen carefully to what God is telling us. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. As yourself. I think that when we hear this, we translate it to mean you shall love your neighbor very much. But that is not really what God is saying. He is not saying very much. He is saying as yourself. And this is actually very important because how do you love yourself? Let me use myself as an example. I don't really know much about other people's shortcomings, but I am painfully aware of mine. I know how often I turn my face from God. I know how often I willingly choose vice over virtue, doubt over faith, hatred over love. I know how often I am my worst enemy. I know of errors I've made of which I am so ashamed that I would never confess to them in public. I know that in God's infinite justice, I deserve infinite punishment. And yet, I wish the best for me. I pray for God to forgive me time and time again. I ask Him to look at me not with the eyes of an all-just God, but with the heart of an all-merciful Father. I pray that I may receive not God's justice, of which I dread, but God's mercy, for which I hope. If I can love me this much, me, whose faults I know so well, I can certainly love my neighbor just as much, whose faults I know not. I can love the homeless, whose story I ignore, the addict, whose problems I discount, the inmate, whose reasons I overlook. Because the one thing I know about them is the same thing I know about me. We are all in need of mercy. Love your neighbor as yourself. Because in Adam, we were made creatures of the God of justice. But in Jesus, we were made children of the God of mercy. I pray that we never forget who we are, and that in our common zeal for justice, we do not forget our common need of mercy. And that at the end of our life on earth, we hear our Father calling us to Him, saying, "Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy."